It was a Friday night, like any other, the air thick with the anticipation of sharp wit and unfiltered commentary. The studio lights blazed down on the set of Real Time with Bill Maher, casting a warm glow over the familiar circular table where the host sat, his trademark smirk already tugging at the corners of his mouth. The audience buzzed with energy, a mix of loyal fans and curious newcomers, all waiting to see what Bill Maher, the acerbic comedian turned political pundit, had in store for them tonight. Little did they know, this episode would become one for the books, a moment where Maher's razor-sharp tongue would slice through the veneer of cable news decorum and land a hilarious, unforgettable jab at one of CNN's rising stars, Kaitlan Collins. If you want to stay up to date on all this news, remember to subscribe to the channel. It's free. The show kicked off as it always did. Maher strode out to applause, his lanky frame clad in a dark suit, his graying hair swept back in a way that suggested he cared just enough about appearances to keep the gig, but not enough to hide his disdain for pretense. He launched into his opening monologue, skewering the week's political absurdities with his usual blend of cynicism and biting humor. The crowd ate it up, laughing at his takes on everything from the latest congressional gridlock to the endless parade of talking heads on TV. But the real fireworks were yet to come. Tonight's guest lineup promised a clash of perspectives. Kaitlan Collins, the poised and polished CNN anchor; James Carville, the fiery Democratic strategist with a voice like a Louisiana gravel road; and Dan Crenshaw, the Texas Republican congressman with an eye patch and a penchant for straight talk. It was a recipe for debate, sure, but no one could have predicted the moment that would steal the show, as the theme music faded and the audience settled. Maher wasted no time diving into the interview segment. Kaitlan Collins took her seat across from him, her blonde hair catching the light, her expression calm but alert, like someone who'd spent years navigating the chaos of White House press briefings and wasn't about to be rattled by a comedian with a microphone. Maher leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and started with a softball. "Kaitlan, you're at CNN, the place where news goes to get a makeover, right?" The audience chuckled, and Collins flashed a tight smile, clearly used to the jabs about her network. "We try to keep it real," she replied, her southern drawl softening the edges of her words. Maher nodded, but his eyes glinted with mischief. He wasn't here to play nice. The conversation quickly turned to CNN's reputation, or lack thereof, in a polarized America. Maher, never one to shy away from calling out what he saw as hypocrisy, brought up a recent viral moment that had been making the rounds online. "You were on Stephen Colbert's show," he said, his voice dripping with mock innocence. And he said something like, "You guys at CNN just report the news straight," and the crowd burst into laughter. The audience in Maher's studio tittered, already sensing where this was headed. Collins shifted slightly in her chair, but her composure held. "I'm a big rooter for CNN," Maher continued, leaning into the sarcasm. "But that tells you a lot, doesn't it? I mean, when even Colbert's crowd, can't keep a straight face at the idea of CNN being objective, you've got a problem." Collins didn't flinch. She'd faced tougher rooms than this. "CNN is the place where both sides can watch," she countered, her tone steady. "I think my show is evidence of that. We have lawmakers from both parties. Elizabeth Warren one night, Ted Cruz the next. I think they should all take questions, and we push them all." It was a solid defense, the kind of polished response you'd expect from someone who'd cut her teeth at the Daily Caller before crossing over to CNN's brighter lights. But Maher wasn't buying it. He tilted his head, his smirk widening into something more predatory. "Oh, come on, Kaitlan," he said, his voice dropping into that faux reasonable register he used when he was about to pounce. "I'm talking about the people on CNN. I know what the conservative side of America thinks, and I don't blame them." The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. Maher was winding up for the pitch, and Collins was in the batter's box, whether she liked it or not. He pressed on, recounting the previous night's Democratic National Convention coverage. "I watched Kamala's speech last night," he said, referring to Vice President Kamala Harris's big moment in Chicago. "It ended at 11:09 Eastern, and from 8:09 to 11:23 Pacific Time, your panel was just gushing about how great it was. I mean, I think she did fine. I'm not saying it was bad, but they were acting like it was the Gettysburg Address delivered by Jesus." The crowd erupted in laughter, a few whoops cutting through the noise. Collins opened her mouth to respond, but Maher wasn't done. And then, he said, his voice rising with glee, "It wasn't until 11:23 that the one conservative guy, what's his name?" "Scott Jennings," Collins supplied, her tone clipped but professional. She knew the playbook. Stay cool, give the facts, don't let him see you sweat. But Maher was in his element now, and he wasn't letting up. "Right, Scott Jennings," he said, snapping his fingers as if he'd just remembered. "Lonely Scott, I call him." The audience roared, the nickname landing like a perfectly timed punchline. Maher leaned back in his chair, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "From 8:09 to 11:23. It's all, oh, Kamala's amazing. She's a goddess." And then Lonely Scott comes on, the token conservative, like he's the last guy at the party who didn't get the memo to leave. If I'm a conservative in America watching CNN for the straight middle-of-the-road take, that's what I get. 15 minutes of cheerleading, and then Lonely Scott trying to squeeze in a word edgewise. The studio was electric now, the laughter rolling in waves. Collins kept her poker face, but you could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She wasn't about to let Maher steamroll her without a fight. "Look, Bill," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. It was the Democratic convention. Of course there were more Democrats on. It's their event. But we do call bullshit on both sides. That's my job, and I do it every night. Maher raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the pushback. "Oh, I'm sure you do," he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "But when I look at your panel, it's like 5-1. It's not even subtle, it's tokenism. It's the view with better lighting." Another burst of laughter from the crowd, and this time even Collins cracked a small smile, as if acknowledging the hit. The exchange didn't end there, though. Maher pivoted to another angle, bringing up Kamala Harris's reluctance to talk to the press, a sore spot for journalists like Collins, who'd built her career on holding power to account. "You think about the fact that Kamala doesn't talk to the press," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "In a way, I feel like it's more insulting than what Trump does. Trump says, 'You're the enemy of the people,' which is bad, don't get me wrong. But she's basically saying, 'I don't need you, you're irrelevant.' To me, that's worse." Collins didn't miss a beat. "I don't know if it's worse than denigrating the press every day," she shot back. "I covered Trump in the White House. I was there every day as a correspondent. He'd try to shake you, lie to your face, get personal. I don't think you can compare the two. But yeah, she should talk to the press. Anyone who wants the nuclear codes should sit down and take questions." Maher nodded, conceding the point, but not the fight. Fair enough, he said. I'd love to have her on the show. Collins jumped in, her competitive streak showing. We'd love to have her too. Maher chuckled. Oh, she'll do you before she does me, he said, winking at the crowd. But we'll see who gets her first. The audience cheered, delighted by the playful rivalry. It was a rare moment of levity in a conversation that had otherwise been a verbal sparring match, and it underscored the chemistry between the two. Maher with his irreverent needling, Collins with her cool-headed defiance. As the segment wrapped up and the show moved on to the panel with Carville and Crenshaw, the buzz in the room lingered. Maher had landed his jab. Lonely Scott was already trending on X by the time the credits rolled, and Collins had held her ground, proving she could take a punch and throw one back. Backstage, the crew swapped stories about the exchange, marveling at how Maher had turned a routine interview into a viral moment. On social media, clips of the Lonely Scott line ricocheted across platforms, with conservatives crowing about CNN's bias and liberals defending Collins's grit. Pundits weighed in, some calling it a cheap shot, others hailing it as Maher at his best. Unafraid to poke the bear, even if the bear was a network that aired his own reruns. For Maher, it was just another night of doing what he'd done for decades, stirring the pot, challenging the narrative, and making people laugh while they squirmed. For Collins, it was a test of her mettle, one she'd passed with the poise of someone who'd faced down bigger storms than a comedian's barbs. And for the audience, both in the studio and at home, it was a reminder of why they tuned in. To see the masks slip, the egos clash, and the truth, however messy, get a moment in the spotlight. The Lonely Scott jab would live on in memes and hot takes, a hilarious footnote in the endless saga of America's media wars. But in that fleeting hour on live TV, it was pure Bill Maher, unfiltered, unrelenting, and undeniably funny. The aftermath of the show rippled through the weekend like a stone dropped in a still pond. By Saturday morning, the clip of Maher's Lonely Scott jab had racked up millions of views online, with ex-users dissecting every frame, some praising Maher's audacity, others accusing him of punching down at a network already bruised by years of credibility critiques. Conservative commentators seized the moment, holding up the exchange as Exhibit A in their case against CNN's alleged bias, while liberal voices rushed to Collins's defense, arguing that her composure under fire only bolstered her reputation as a serious journalist. Caught in the crossfire was Scott Jennings himself, the bespectacled pundit whose late-night cameo had unwittingly made him the butt of Maher's zinger. Jennings took it in stride, tweeting a good-natured, "Guess I need to work on my party timing," complete with a winking emoji. A move that earned him a rare round of bipartisan applause for not taking himself too seriously. Back at CNN's Atlanta headquarters, the mood was a mix of irritation and defiance. Producers huddled over coffee-stained desks, debating whether to lean into the Maher jab or ignore it altogether. Collins, ever the professional, brushed it off in a morning meeting, reportedly saying, "If I can handle Trump's press room, I can handle Bill Maher." Her colleagues nodded, but behind closed doors, some wondered if the Lonely Scott line would stick, a nagging splinter in CNN's ongoing struggle to reclaim its mantle as the neutral arbiter of news. The network's primetime lineup that night subtly shifted, with Jennings getting a slightly longer segment, perhaps a quiet rebuttal to Maher's tokenism charge, or maybe just a coincidence. Either way, the cameras caught Jennings smirking as he delivered a dry quip about the DNC, and for a moment, It felt like he was in on the joke. Across town, Maher was already on to the next thing, lounging in his Los Angeles office with a stack of newspapers and a glass of something amber. He'd seen the online frenzy, of course. He always did, but he wasn't one to dwell. "It's just comedy," he'd say if pressed, though anyone who knew him understood it was more than that. For Maher, the jab wasn't just a laugh line. It was a Molotov cocktail lobbed at what he saw as the sanctimonious posturing of cable news, CNN included. He'd been railing against the media's self-righteousness since his politically incorrect days, and this was just the latest salvo. His producers, meanwhile, were thrilled. The ratings bump from the Collins segment was undeniable, and they were already brainstorming ways to keep the momentum going. Get Scott Jennings on. One suggested half seriously. Call it Lonely Scott's Revenge. The cultural fallout kept spreading. On Sunday talk shows, pundits picked over the exchange like vultures on a carcass. MSNBC's Joy Reid dismissed Maher as a grumpy old contrarian, while Fox's Sean Hannity gleefully replayed the clip crowing, "Even a broken clock like Maher is right twice a day." Late-night hosts couldn't resist either. Colbert, ever the CNN defender, worked it into his Monday monologue, quipping, "Bill Maher called Scott Jennings Lonely Scott, which is rich coming from a guy whose only friend is a thesaurus." The audience roared, and the cycle of jabs continued, each network feeding off the other in a bizarre Ouroboros of outrage and irony. It was peak 2025 media, a single offhand comment metastasizing into a week-long circus. Collins, for her part, stayed above the fray. She popped up on her Monday night show, The Source, looking as unruffled as ever, her crisp blazer and steady gaze a silent rebuke to the chaos. She didn't mention Maher directly. Why give him the satisfaction? But her choice of guests spoke volumes. A balanced mix of voices, including a fiery debate between a progressive senator and a Trump-aligned strategist. If Maher was watching, he might have grudgingly tipped his hat. If he wasn't, she didn't care. Her ratings held steady, a testament to her knack for weathering storms. Off-air, friends said she'd laughed about the Lonely Scott line over drinks that weekend, calling it vintage Maher, half-truth, half-theater. She wasn't wrong. The comedian himself doubled down on his next real-time episode, opening with a sly nod to the brouhaha. "I got some heat for calling out CNN last week," he said, pausing for effect as the crowd cheered. "Apparently, I hurt their feelings. Don't worry, folks, they've got a whole panel of therapists on speed dial." Right after Lonely Scott, the laughter was deafening, and Maher soaked it in, clearly relishing the chance to twist the knife. He didn't bring Collins back into it. She'd taken her licks and moved on, but the subtext was clear. He wasn't sorry, and he wasn't done. The rest of the show pivoted to other targets, but the Lonely Scott saga had cemented its place in the Maher canon, a go-to riff for future monologues. Online, the meme machine churned relentlessly. Photoshopped images of Jennings standing alone in a crowd, captioned, "Lonely Scott at the DNC," flooded X, while TikTokers stitched the Maher clip with their own hot takes, some defending CNN's honor, others amplifying Maher's critique. A particularly viral one featured a sad trombone sound as Jennings's face appeared, earning a retweet from Maher himself, an anointing that sent the creator's follower count soaring. The phrase "Lonely Scott" even briefly trended alongside hashtag #MarvyCollins, a testament to how a single quip could hijack the zeitgeist. Academics weighed in too, with media studies professors penning think pieces about tokenism and balance in cable news, citing the exchange as a case study in perception versus reality. The political class couldn't stay silent either. Ted Cruz, a frequent Collins guest, jumped on X to crow. Bill Maher's right. CNN's a cheerleading squad with a conservative mascot. Lonely Scott deserves a medal. Elizabeth Warren, meanwhile, fired back on a podcast, calling Maher a guy who thinks he's edgy but just recycles Fox talking points. The partisan sniping only fueled the fire, turning a late-night zinger into a proxy war for America's soul, or at least its remote controls. Maher, ever the provocateur, watched it all unfold with a grin, knowing he'd lit the match. For Scott Jennings, the unexpected spotlight brought a mix of amusement and annoyance. He leaned into it on his next CNN appearance, deadpanning, "I'm here to represent the lonely conservative voice. Someone's gotta do it." The panel laughed, and even Collins cracked a smile, a rare break in her on-air armor. Off camera, Jennings reportedly texted Maher tongue-in-cheek, "Thanks for the fame, jerk," to which Maher replied, "Anytime lonely." The exchange stayed private, but it hinted at a mutual respect, or at least a shared understanding of the game they were all playing. The dust began to settle by midweek, as the news cycle churned toward fresher outrage. Maher's jab faded from the headlines, but its echo lingered in green rooms and barrooms alike. At CNN, execs quietly vowed to tweak the panel balance, if only to dodge future Lonely Scott barbs. Collins kept doing what she did best, grilling guests with surgical precision, while Maher prepped for his next target, undeterred by the blowback. The audience, meanwhile, moved on to the next viral moment, their attention spans as fleeting as the news ticker at the bottom of their screens. Yet for those who'd witnessed it live, that Friday night stayed etched in memory. A masterclass in comedy cutting through the noise. It wasn't just about Lonely Scott or CNN's woes. It was about Maher's gift for exposing the absurd and Collins's steel in facing it down. The clash had been brief but brutal, a snapshot of a media landscape where truth was a punching bag and laughter was the sharpest weapon. And somewhere, in the overlap of their worlds, a begrudging admiration simmered. Two pros at the top of their games, trading blows under the hot lights. The Lonely Scott line became a shorthand among Maher's fans, a rallying cry for those who saw him as a truth-teller in a sea of spin. For Collins's supporters, it was a badge of honor. She'd stared down the lion and walked away unscathed. The moment passed, as all moments do, but its ripples kept spreading, a reminder of how a single quip could ignite a firestorm. In the end, Maher got his laugh, Collins kept her dignity, and America got another glimpse at the messy, hilarious underbelly of its news machine. Months later, at a DC cocktail party, someone asked Collins about the Maher episode over a glass of Pinot. She shrugged, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Bill's Bill," she said simply. "He swings, you duck, or you swing back." I swung back. Across the country, Maher was probably saying something similar, glass in hand, smirk intact. The fight was over, but the ring was always there, waiting for the next round. And in the strange, symbiotic dance of comedy and journalism, they'd both be ready when the bell rang again. That DC cocktail party wasn't the last time the Maher-Collins clash came up in conversation. As spring bled into summer, the Lonely Scott moment lingered like a stubborn aftertaste, popping up at media gatherings and water cooler chats across the country. Journalists swapped war stories about their own run-ins with Maher's wit, while comedians cited the exchange as proof that live TV was still the ultimate proving ground. At a New York media conference in June, a panel on comedy and cable news devoted a full 10 minutes to dissecting the jab, with one speaker, a grizzled former producer, calling it the perfect storm of snark and substance. Collins, absent from the event, was the unspoken star, her cool-headed rebuttal held up as a model for navigating the Maher gauntlet. Back on Real Time, Maher didn't let the gag die quietly. He sprinkled Lonely Scott references into monologues throughout the season, each one drawing a Pavlovian laugh from his audience. During a July episode, he took it a step further, unveiling a mock CNN graphic with Jennings's face in a tiny corner box, captioned, "The Lonely Conservative, one man's fight for airtime." The crowd howled, and the clip raced across X, reigniting the debate among the platform's chattering class. Maher's team knew they'd struck gold. The recurring bit wasn't just funny. It kept the original moment alive, a gift that kept on giving in the form of clicks and retweets. Behind the scenes, Maher scribbled notes for a potential stand-up special, circling the CNN riff as a centerpiece. Collins, meanwhile, kept her focus on the grind. Her show, The Source, hit a stride that summer, pulling in steady numbers despite the relentless noise of the 2024 election hangover. She booked high-profile guests, cabinet secretaries, swing state governors, pushing them with the same relentless questioning that had defined her White House days. If Maher's jab had rattled her, it didn't show. If anything, it seemed to sharpen her edge. Off-air, she stayed tight-lipped about the incident, but colleagues noticed a subtle shift, a quicker laugh, a dry quip here and there, as if she'd absorbed a bit of Maher's playbook without losing her own. When a junior producer pitched a Lonely Scott segment as a tongue-in-cheek nod, she shot it down with a single word. No, the message was clear. She'd play the game, but on her terms. The saga took an unexpected turn in August, when Scott Jennings himself became an unlikely beneficiary. A conservative think tank offered him a speaking gig titled The Lonely Voice, surviving the media wilderness, complete with a hefty paycheck. Jennings, ever the pragmatist, accepted, turning Maher's barb into a personal brand. His speech, delivered to a packed room of GOP donors, leaned hard into the humor, with lines like, "Bill Maher made me famous, but CNN pays the bills." The crowd loved it, and Jennings walked away with a bump in his pundit stock, proving that even a punchline could be a stepping stone in the right hands. Maher, catching wind of it, texted him a begrudging "well played," cementing their oddball camaraderie. By fall, the Lonely Scott phenomenon had seeped into pop culture's bloodstream. A late-night sketch on Saturday Night Live featured Kate McKinnon as Collins, deadpanning through a chaotic CNN panel, while Beck Bennett's Jennings sulked in a corner muttering, "Can I talk now?" The audience roared, and Maher tweeted his approval. SNL gets it. Lonely Scott lives. Collins, watching from her DC apartment, reportedly rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress a chuckle. The parody wasn't cruel. It was too absurd for that. But it underscored how deeply the moment had lodged in the collective psyche. Even Netflix sniffed around, pitching a Maher-hosted special with a working title, Lonely Scott and Other American Tragedies. Politicians kept the flame alive, too. During a Senate floor speech, a Republican from Kentucky name-dropped Lonely Scott, while railing against media bias, earning a rare bipartisan snicker from the chamber. Democrats countered in private, with one aide whispering to Politico that Maher's shtick is getting old. He's just yelling at clouds now. But the clouds kept raining attention, and Maher wasn't about to put up an umbrella. His November episode featured a surprise cameo from Jennings, who strode on stage to thunderous applause, shook Maher's hand, and deadpanned, "I brought my own mic this time." The bit lasted 3 minutes. Jennings got in a few digs at CNN's groupthink, but the real win was the optics. Maher and his punching bag, side by side, milking the gag for all it was worth. Collins watched that one from the CNN control room, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She didn't call Maher out. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any retort, a signal that she'd moved on even if the world hadn't. Her year-end numbers came in strong, buoyed by a post-election surge, and whispers of a bigger slot at CNN started circulating. Maher's jab had been a blip, a flare in the sky, but it hadn't dimmed her star. If anything, it had burnished her rep as unflappable, a quality that mattered more than any viral zinger in the long game of journalism. The cultural echo chamber churned on into winter. A viral X thread recast the Maher Collins clash as a Shakespearean drama. The Bard of HBO versus the Maiden of CNN, complete with florid dialogue and iambic pentameter. English professors shared it with glee, while students turned it into a TikTok trend, lip-syncing lines like, "Oh lonely Scot, forsaken in thy box." Maher retweeted the thread with a simple genius, while Collins stayed offline, prepping for a holiday break in South Carolina. The absurdity of it all. How a single quip had spiraled into a year-long saga. Felt quintessentially American. A nation obsessed with its own reflection in the funhouse mirror of media. Come January, the anniversary of the original episode loomed, and producers on both sides smelled opportunity. Real Time teased a lonely Scott reunion, with Jennings confirmed and rumors swirling of a Collins cameo. CNN, not to be outdone, floated a special where Collins would host Maher for a no-holds-barred Q&A. Neither materialized, scheduling conflicts, they said, but the hype kept the story alive. X lit up with predictions, from Maher will apologize, unlikely, to Collins will own him, possible. In the end, Maher marked the occasion with a throwaway line in his monologue. 1 year since Lonely Scott, and CNN still pretending it's Switzerland, while Collins ignored it, breaking a story on Capitol Hill instead. The slow fade continued through spring. Maher's stand-up tour sold out, with Lonely Scott, a staple of his set, while Collins landed a splashy interview with a reclusive tech billionaire, cementing her ascent. Jennings parlayed his niche fame into a book deal, Token, a conservative's life in liberal media, slated for a fall release. The trio had moved on, their paths diverging, but forever linked by that electric night in April 2025. Fans still swapped clips online, and media scholars added it to syllabi, but the heat had cooled, the spotlight shifting to fresher feuds. Yet in quiet moments, the players reflected. Maher, sipping bourbon in his LA den, knew he'd landed a classic, one for the highlight reel. Collins, jogging along the Potomac, saw it as a baptism by fire, a rite of passage in a career built on resilience. Jennings, typing his manuscript, grinned at the irony. A punchline had made him a player. The world spun on, but that Friday night remained a fixed point, a collision of comedy, journalism, and raw nerve that left a mark. In the broader tapestry of 2025, it was a footnote, a fleeting flare amid wars, elections, and scandals. But for those who'd lived it, on stage, on screen, or in the audience, it was a story worth retelling. A reminder that in America's endless culture war, the sharpest weapons weren't bullets or ballots, but words slung with precision and a laugh to back them up. The Lonely Scot saga faded into lore, but its spirit endured, a testament to the power of a jab well thrown. And so, as the years ticked by, the clip stayed alive on YouTube, racking up views from nostalgists and newbies alike. Maher grew grayer, Collins climbed higher, and Jennings carved his niche. But that moment, raw, real, and riotously funny, held fast. A time capsule of a fractured era. It waited for the next generation to stumble upon it, laugh, and wonder what all the fuss was about. In the end, it was just Bill being Bill, Kaitlan being Kaitlan, and America being America, messy, loud, and never quite done with the fight.